more contemporary artist Slash. I know you know him pretty well, and I know he had requested a copy of a book that I co-wrote, so I know he has some kind of an interest. Has he had some experience?
He hasn't talked to me about it. He's a really good friend of mine. I saw him a couple days ago in L.A., and, I don't know if anybody knows about this. There's a wonderful documentary that John Chester did on my life and work called Rock Prophecies, and Slash was one of the first guys to come forward, and Jeff Beck, and the Stevie Ray story. I know you were talking about that a little while ago. That's how the film starts, and so if anybody interested in seeing those photos, those final photos of Stevie Ray, they are in that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us the story, because it goes beyond just UFOs and aliens, I think.
Yeah, Stevie and I become really good friends in 1989 on a Jeff Beck tour, and Stevie was in a terribly bad state before he sobered up, and he was his life was fantastically turned around, and he was very sober and very clean, and we talked a lot about, life and death, and, we became very good friends, and then he called me in 1990 to do a photo shoot with he and Eric Clapton and Robert Cray and his brother Jimmy Vaughn in Alpine Valley, Wisconsin. And it was a 2-day affair. And the first day, all the photographers were there, and we were meant to do the shoot. And Eric forgot his clothing, and he said, "We'll do it tomorrow." And he said, "Robert, don't shoot today. You can have tomorrow to yourself." So I just sat around and didn't shoot anything and talked to Stevie. And we started talking about, life and death. And he said, "I have a feeling that I don't have too much longer to go." And I go, "Why?" And he said, "I don't know. I have this feeling." But he said, "If anything ever happens, there's nothing you can do about it." And I said, "Well, did you know Otis Redding died nearby here?" And he said, "Did you know my manager used to manage Otis Redding?" And there was all this synchronicity piling up. So the next day, I did the photo shoot, and Stevie, asked me to do this finale number, which was the Jimi Hendrix song and Voodoo Child. And he said, "This is for you and me, because this was the same day that Jimmy ever played it the last time," or something like this. And while I was doing it, my hands turned to ice, and I almost couldn't hold the camera, and I ran from the stage area. And when he came off, he came up to me, and he said, "What happened?" And I said, "Look at my arms. They're just like frozen." And he rolled his sleeve up, and he said, "So are mine." And, there was this really strange sort of thing going on. We both could feel it. And he suddenly said to me, "You need to go down this back road. Don't go out this road. Go out this way." And I walked him down to the helicopter, and he knew that he had been a bit morose with me for the last couple of days. And he just said, "Listen, Robert, if anything ever happens to me, you know me when you hear me." And the next morning I woke up, and I found out he was gone, and it just it was very upsetting. But what makes the story even more interesting is many years later, I'm on the road with John Mayer and Sheryl Crow, and a person that used to work for Stevie, I don't want to say who it is because he's never really come forward, he said, "When you were out there shooting Stevie on Voodoo Child," he said, "I went in the dressing room, and Stevie was in the dressing room. He was sitting there, and he talked to me. And he said, I've never told anybody, but I know that you will understand." And so it was happening to more than one of us that night.
And the photo, the final photos, you have them in your gallery here in Las Vegas.
I do, and it was the saddest photo I've ever done. People always say, "Well, what photo, is the most important to you?" And for me, it was that picture of Stevie Ray, Eric Clapton, and how happy he looked. And both Clapton and I reflected later, like, could we have made a difference? If I didn't do that photo shoot, would it have changed anything? But you can't be that way. Life is like every single thing led up to that moment, not just one thing. And so, it's been...
well, I remember seeing it seemed like there was some weird energy thing around his head, isn't there?
Well, that's another series of photos I have, and I call it... Stevie used to sign on his album cover Soul to Soul. And I have 3 frames where it looks like his life force, like a piece of energy, comes into his back, and then it comes out his solar plexus, through his stomach, through his forehead, and it just spreads out. And I've shown that to Hal Puthoff, who's a major physicist, and he said it looks like coherent light, and if it was a light leak in the camera, we would have seen it leaking on the edge of the film frame, and I to this day can't place what that was, but I call that shot Soul to Soul, and it's just 3 frames, and I've blown it up 70 inches, and it's just amazing to see this life force flowing through this musician while he was playing.
Yeah, it is a cool shot. Ever hear any stories from Heart? I don't know if you know Ann and
Well,
Nancy
I know
Wilson.
them, but I haven't heard. They're in town, I think, in a week too. But I got to tell you, the single best story is Steve Lukather, who is the guitar player from Toto. He was driving over Mulholland about 11 o'clock at night after a session, completely sober, and he sees this triangle floating above Mulholland, not very high. And he stops the car, and he gets out, and he's making mental notes. He's not making any noise, and it's sort of bobbing like a bobber on water on a calm lake. And he's watching this, and it's slowly moving. And he said all of a sudden all these helicopters came and surrounded it and escorted it off out toward Bell Canyon, where there was a rumor that something went down a few years ago. And I don't know if the two events are connected, but Steve had this fantastic first-hand experience, and he's one of my buddies that just really, we really, go on to the topic whenever we see each other.
Wow, well, that sounds similar to the Cash Landrum case, the big triangle and the helicopter surrounding it.
Yeah, and then Jennifer Batten, who was Michael Jackson's guitarist and Jeff Beck's guitarist, she told me about 7-8 years ago she was in Sylmar in her backyard, went to take a break, laid outside, was looking up the sky, and she sees these three lights that formed a triangle shape. And it didn't make any noise, came in over the head, and then shot off, and she said immediately there were 3 military jets chasing after it. So there was a sort of repeated thing of the triangle shape, from the Brad Whitford sighting in New York to the Lukather to the Jennifer Batten. So it's, kind of interesting, that shape.
Like a flying saucer, right?
So, and, I think I think all the people in the creative arts are just somewhat open to this, and I think if you just sort of tested the water, a lot of rock stars would have seen this, and we'll talk about it. I mean,
Well, we only got a couple of minutes left here, Robert, so I can't get any more calls. I don't want to know, but I do want to hear about you said you're working on this project with Nick Cook that became a film. You also have a TV thing going. Are you ready to talk about that?
Nick and I are working on a really cool concept, which is basically a defense journalist and a rock and roll photographer going around the world looking at unusual things. It's not a UFO thing particularly, or we wouldn't be looking at Roswell or anything like that, but we would be looking at things that maybe haven't been covered before. But what we're really working on right now is this documentary on the life and work of Ingo Swann. And I never thought Ingo would agree to do it, because he turns everything down. And Nick Cook called me one day and he said, "Do you think Ingo would allow a documentary to be made?" And I said, "No, but I'll ask." And I called Ingo, and he said, "If Nick Cook does it, I'll do it." And so we've been working on it for over a year. We've been shooting. We have about 50 hours with Ingo. And, Ingo has just told us some very profound things, and I know that there were some remote viewing targets that were off-world. He did a book called Penetration, and, he had a very close call and a close incident where he was taken to a northern place and allowed to see something. So we got a lot of that, And one of the more interesting things that happened, though, there was a remote viewer that Ingo trained that still has his tickets and still works for military intelligence, and he started telling us about a target he did, and he discovered that it was Mars. And when he started telling us on camera about being on Mars and seeing something, a vortex formed above his head and created a mini tornado. And you can see it in the film. It's just swirling around, and the trees and everything are flying. I mean, it was really wild, and we had to stop shooting until this thing would dissipate, and then we started again. So this is the first time this guy's ever come forward, and he's never really, come and identified himself before, but he's in the Ingo documentary. So hopefully we'll get this out soon.
Well, I should tell people I've seen about 20-minute clip out of the Ingo documentary, and I know you're still working on it, but wow, it's great stuff. And you have a target date about when it will come out?
We're talking to some TV people right now, because really what we're trying to do is to get it on the right network. John Staller, one of our producers, has enabled us to do this thing without the network saying you got to do this or you got to do this. And we've kept it on theme, and we want to make sure that when we get it on the right network that it stays on theme and it doesn't become, the history of remote viewing or something. We really want it to be about Ingo and his work and his writing and the scientific, rap that he was, and probably one of the most tested psychics in history.
Yeah. Yep.
And
Robert Knight, it's been
accurate.
I enjoy every time we have a conversation, Robert. I really want to have you come back on for a full program sometime, maybe when your Ingo Swann show is ready to go, or the TV show. Really appreciate you coming on.
And